Hi, my name is Tamara Benson. I'm the Assistant Curator for Reeves Museum. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Reeves Readers Victorian Book Club and how we began the club and the books that we've read while we've been doing it. But first I want to tell you a little bit about the reason we started the club. And that actually goes back quite a few years to 1979 when I was in 4th grade at Dover South School. We came over on a field trip and we spent the whole day here at Reeves learning about the Reeves family, of course, and also about local Dover history. While we were on that visit, when we got to the study or the library, I told my 4th grade teacher that I was not interested in going any further. I was going to stay there and read for the rest of the day and they could just come back and get me later. Unfortunately for me, they wouldn't let me do that and they made me stay with the group and finish the tour, which I'm sure was lovely, but of course all I remember is that I wasn't allowed to stay and read for the rest of the day, which is what I wanted to do. Anyway, flash forward about 40 years and I am now working at the Reeves Museum where it's my responsibility to catalog things, and it's my great pleasure to be able to spend as much time in the library as I would like. And one day while I was in the library looking at the books and doing some work with them, I noticed that in the front of every book there's a signature of the owner of those books, and I started noticing patterns about who owned what books. So one of the patterns that was really prevalent was that one particular author, Mrs. Eden Southworth, was loved, it seems, by Mrs. Jane Reeves. There were a number of books by the same author, and that kind of got me interested in why Mrs. Reeves herself was really interested in this author. And I started researching the author and found that she was very interesting and very popular at the time. And because of that, we decided that it would be a lot of fun to start our own book club focusing on Victorian authors in particular, and even more particularly on authors that we found in our own library at the Reeves Museum. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the other authors we chose today. There was a progression, sometimes a little away from Victorian authors, but I will explain that as we go. Thanks. The first book that we chose was The Missing Bride by Eden Southworth. Mrs. Southworth was a really interesting author. She was born in Washington, D.C. in 1819 and trained as a teacher. In 1840, she married Frederick Southworth of New York and then moved to Wisconsin to become a teacher. In 1843, she returned to Washington, D.C., though without her husband and with 2 children. It seemed that after the birth of their second child, Frederick abandoned his family in search of Brazilian gold and was never heard from again. Mrs. Southworth never divorced her husband on conscientious grounds. After her husband deserted her, she began to write stories to support herself and her children. Eventually, she signed a contract to write exclusively for the New York Ledger, owned by Robert E. Bonner. The exclusive contract, signed with Bonner in 1856 and royalties from her published novels, earned her about $10,000 a year, making her one of the country's best-paid writers. Like her friend Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was a supporter of social change and women's rights. She passed away in June of 1898. The Missing Bride is a psychological romance and set during the Revolutionary War. We chose this novel out of the 4 Southworth novels in the library at the Reeves Museum because it was the earliest, being published in 1855. Because the next meeting of the Reeves Readers was going to be in October, we decided to go for something with kind of a suspenseful or spooky feel to it. It was for that reason that we chose The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. This novel is a 19th century British epistolary novel, meaning it's written as a series of documents, usually letters and diary entries, though sometimes newspaper clippings. It's also considered to be the first detective novel, and it established many of the ground rules for the modern detective novel, such as the use of red herrings, a celebrated skilled professional investigator, a bungling local constabulary, and a final plot twist. The next book the Reeves Readers tackled was Possession by A.S. Byatt. Though this book is modern, written in 1990, it does have a Victorian connection. Possession is the tale of a pair of young scholars researching the lives of two Victorian poets. They uncover their letters, journals, and poems and track the poets' movements from London to Yorkshire, from spiritualist seances to the fairy-haunted far west of Brittany, and what emerges is an extraordinary counterpoint of passions and ideas. Even though the book wasn't exactly Victorian, and it wasn't found on the shelves of the Reeves Museum, we felt it fit very well. In addition to reading the book, we also watched the movie and decided that that was something we would try to do with the other books that we were choosing. Occasionally, books are donated to the Dover Historical Society and the Reeves Museum because of the connection to local Dover history. That was the case with our next book, The Need of Change by Julian Street. It wasn't a book that belonged to the Reeves originally, but instead it has a tie to the local area. In this relatively short story, a local couple from Canal Dover, of all places, is traveling in Europe and meets a European couple who invite them to drop in on them if they're coming to England. Eventually they do, and they find themselves in for a formal weekend at a castle flanked by an alarming array of servants and a program of entertainment for which they are wholly unprepared. Even without the connection to Canal Dover, it would have been a really fun and short read. We enjoyed Julian Street's writing so much that we decided to read a couple other of his short stories, such as The Sharpness of Steel, Shipboard, and My Enemy the Motor, for the next meeting. The next book that the Reeves Readers tackled was Persuasion by Jane Austen. It was the last novel fully completed by her and published at the end of 1817, 6 months after her death. Our group spent a couple of meetings discussing Persuasion and also watching the movie adaptation of it. We were varied in our responses to it and had some really interesting talks about the characters and also about the many themes in the novel. To be honest, this is probably the book out of all of them that we had read so far that had the most discussion. Next up was Silas Marner, George Eliot's tale of a solitary miser gradually redeemed by the joy of fatherhood. Silas Marner is a story of a man who is wrongly accused of theft in a religious community and thrown out. He eventually moves to another town, Raveloe, and lives and works as a weaver, but is very bitter. His only thought is for the money that he hoards. One day, however, an orphan child finds his way into his house and changes his life. Silas Marner, George Eliot's favorite of her novels, combines humor, rich symbolism, and pointed social criticism to create an unsentimental but affectionate portrait of rural life. Our next choice was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, though published under the pen name of Courier Bell, in October of 1847. Most of us were already familiar with the tale of Jane Eyre, orphaned as a child and an outcast her entire life. After teaching many years at her school, Lowood, she takes a job at Thornfield Hall as the governess to young Adele Varens, a French girl. Though Jane finds Mr. Rochester initially very arrogant, eventually she spends a lot of time with him and begins to fall in love. But of course, not everything can go smoothly in a Victorian novel, and it doesn't. This novel revolutionized prose fiction by being the first to focus on its protagonist's moral and spiritual development through an intimate first-person narrative. And because of this, Charlotte Bronte has been called the literary ancestor of writers like Proust and Joyce. Our book club discussed the topics of class, sexuality, religion, and feminism, among other things, and had to agree with critics that it, along with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, is one of the most famous romance novels of all time. In March of 2020, the Reeves Readers were set to discuss the novel The Eyre Affair by Jasper Fforde. It was published in 2001 and takes place in an alternative 1985 where literary detective Thursday Next pursues a master criminal through the world of Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel Jane Eyre. Fforde received 76 rejections for earlier works before being accepted by a publisher. Though critical reception of this novel was generally positive, remarking on its originality. We decided it seemed like a good idea to read this novel after having finished Jane Eyre just recently.